Before we start this week's podcast, I'd just like to say a quick thank you to our sponsor, Money Farm. Now, for those of you who don't know, Money Farm are one of the biggest digital wealth managers in the UK and Europe. They not only have a stocks and shares ISA, but they now have a pension which they can run for you. And now we've secured an exclusive deal for Money to the Masses podcast listeners and Money to the Masses readers, where Money Farm will reimburse the exit fees and dealing charges charged by your existing pension provider if you transfer to them. You can find out our view on Money Farm by going onto the moneytothemasses.com website and searching for Money Farm Pension Review, where you'll also find all the T's and C's. Now on with this week's show.
Hello and welcome to episode 194 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leeks. Damien, welcome back. How you doing?
I'm good this week, Andy, because Tottenham beat Watford in the, whatever they're called. What cup is it now?
The Carabao Cup. And for people who don't know, Damien's a diehard Spurs fan and I'm a Watford fan. So every so often, at least at the moment, Watford and Spurs tend to get matched up at least twice a season. And we've been lucky this season. They were also drawn in a cup. So we've got the best of three. Watford won the first one in the league. Spurs have won this one. So what do you reckon? Should we double or nothing on the next one, Damien?
Luckily, I was on holiday. It was the week we didn't have a podcast, wasn't it, that you played us in the league, so that's why I didn't talk about it. I'm not just one of those people who sings when he's winning. No, I'm all good, Andy. Yeah, lots going on at Money to the Masses, still building the project I really want to talk about, but I will do in the coming months when we've got something we can show people, because we'll want their feedback on what we're building. And part of the reason I can't really give you any more than that is because there are lots of other people out there who are watching what we're doing, trying to see what our next move is, because thanks to all the support of everybody who listens to the podcast, read the books, the website, the name and brand of Money to the Masses and me are growing exponentially. So that's all good news, Andy, and obviously because of your hard work on the podcast too. So yeah, all good. How about you? How's your week been?
Yeah, it's been really good. I've given myself a day off this week, so we're recording this podcast on my day off from my day job, which is really nice. My phone died in the week, so that's always an expensive and stressful time, but I'm going over to the dark side. I'm going over to Samsung, so I'm sure that'll be fine, but I'm just a little bit apprehensive. So moving over from Apple to Samsung, Android, I don't know. It's a weird time for me.
I mean, trying to wean yourself off a phone, I've updated to the latest software on my iPhone, and I'm a fan because they've got this, I don't know what you call it, but it's a scheduling. It's actually got a restriction where you can put at a certain time of day or after a certain period of time on your phone, it can block apps. So I've been doing it, but I'm massively into social media now. Anyone who will have noticed if they follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, the quality of what's going out there has gone up a notch, and that's very deliberate. Stuff we're doing in the background of people working for us, with us, to be able to make that happen. But it does mean I spend probably more time than I should on social media with Money to the Masses. So if you do want to get in touch, go on Twitter, go on Instagram and write on there, because the chances are you're going to get me pretty pronto. So there, you can win yourself off your phone, Andy, by intention. I'm trying to do that, but at the same time I'm countering that with my new dedication to responding to all things social media. One thing, all that noise, if you hear any odd noises in the background, I must quickly mention that we have a almost studio guest this week, because Andy was house sitting stroke dog sitting last week, and the dog has followed him home, it would appear, and is now in Andy's house. And you can, if Andy puts his sound on,
you're gonna make a noise. Who's that?
See, all we've got is Andy making dog noises there, but there is a dog. Trust me, I can see it. So if you hear the odd whimper, that's Bertie. So one thing I want to talk about before I'll tell you about what's on the podcast this week first. We had some really good feedback. There was Bertie there. We'll block out the rest of him for the rest of the podcast. But the really good feedback we had this week on the podcast related to two pieces last week. The income protection piece, which we're going to focus on that, because we had somebody who got in touch and has allowed us to share their story, which Andy will read out shortly, which was fantastic. It just shows the benefit of such a policy insuring against disaster, and also the benefit of financial advice. So we're going to lead on from that and do a similar piece, but around critical illness. And David, a listener, got in touch to ask about the child benefit issue that I picked up on last week, about people who didn't register for child benefit because they were earning over £50,000 a year. Now, go back if you've not listened to that podcast, because it means there are a lot of people who are going to miss out on a full state pension. And David's follow-up question to that was, well, what can you do if you are one of those people who's fallen into that sort of gap? And the final piece that I'm going to do, I say final because there's an outside chance, depending on time, and I might get onto another one as well, is about the investing landscape and really the lessons that were learned after the financial crisis. Because we've not done it, actually touched upon it, Andy, but it's 10 years since the financial crisis. I don't know if you knew that. I say the financial crisis. Recently, it was 10 years since the Lehman's collapsed. And if I'm right in thinking, we've never spoken about it on the podcast, have we?
No, we haven't, no.
No, so I can't let that pass without some sort of reflection and actually some investment insight for people out there about the importance, why it's still important to recognise what happened 10 years ago for your investment portfolio. And if we get time, there may be another piece, but we'll see how the timing goes, because I'll be spoiling you. Right, so which are we going to go with first? I think, Andy, it should be the income protection piece. So I will let you read this out shortly, but just to give you the background, we did the income protection insurance myth. So income protection can actually protect your income, hence the name, if you fall ill or have an accident and are unable to work. And it's one of the insurances that is pretty much overlooked by everybody. Financial advisors who are worth their money will try and recommend it, not just because they might make money out of it, but because you're much more likely to be unable to work than you are to actually die at certain ages. So particularly if you're young, we're talking about working age here. So we did a piece last week, and what Andy's going to read out is an email that I got this week that just I thought was fantastic and does a better job of explaining the importance of it by demonstrating it than I could ever do by just whittering on a podcast. So Andy, over to you.
Okay, so yeah, here it is. Hi, having listened to your podcast last week, I wanted to give an insight into my experience of income protection policies. When me and my husband divorced 15 years ago, I consulted a financial advisor to arrange a mortgage. He also recommended I take out an income protection policy, which I did under his advice. 10 years later, I was unfortunately diagnosed with the autoimmune condition rheumatoid arthritis. And even though I worked for a public sector organisation who had numerous benefits like sick pay and support mechanisms, after 5 years I'd reduced my hours, taken on less responsibility and had the opportunity to, say, lie down and rest at lunchtime, etc. But I still wasn't coping and I had a really poor quality of life. So finally I decided that I just had to stop working. The money then paid out from the policy and has honestly made such a huge difference to my life. And although my illness has meant I've had to drastically change so many things, finances have been one thing I haven't had to worry about. The only slight negative was that the policy term was only until I retired at 60, when my state pension would start, but then the government decided to change my retirement age to age 67. At least I've been lucky enough to be able to put strategies into place to mitigate this and ensure my standard of living won't be hugely reduced, which wouldn't have been the case if I hadn't taken out the income protection and taken the advice. I have subsequently contacted the advisor and thanked him so much for his recommendation on the insurance. I hope this is useful. Anonymous. So I think that's really it explains it perfectly, doesn't it, Damien?
Yeah, I mean, to demonstrate the benefit of the advice and the policy in such a way is fantastic, and it's something the industry does very badly at. They try and sell you the product and try and say why it would be beneficial, but they don't often have a case study in effect. So if you are interested in income protection, go onto moneytothemasses.com and search income protection insurance. And in particular, I wrote an article, Income Protection Insurance, Do You Need It? And in there, you'll find everything you need to know, including how you could go and get any quotes that you might want and to actually get good, decent advice that we've actually looked at the guys delivering it and vetted it. So moving on from that, great start to the podcast. The power of last week's piece on income protection insurance, I thought we'd do the equivalent for critical illness. So looking at some of the myths that are out there surrounding critical illness. Now, critical illness insurance, for those who don't know, is an insurance policy that pays out if you are diagnosed with one of a set number of conditions. So a set condition under the insurance policy. So to give an example, it may be some form of cancer. So let's just say bowel cancer, for example. Now, it's not about whether you die from the condition or not, it's about when you were diagnosed. So this really is about helping you pay for things. It could be your mortgage, it could be debts. In the instance that you probably will end up being too sick to work, it's actually taking that weight off your shoulders. So critical illness, again, you can search Money to the Masses for the full sort of lowdown on it. But here are some myths about critical illness insurance that I just will give you a good flavour of the type of policy that it is. Now, the first one is that few people become critically ill. And so really it's just an expensive product that you don't really need. But if you think about it, the stats show that a 30-year-old has a 14% chance of getting a critical illness before the age of 65. Now, a critical illness will be defined by the policy. Every policy has slightly different definitions and different illnesses. But what you've got to think about, it's the serious ones that are going to end up making such a big difference to your life and health. So like it'll be things to do relating to heart attacks. Like I said, most cancers, certain types of cancers, different severity of different illnesses. So the chances are 14%. Now, 14% obviously doesn't sound incredibly high, but it's not zero, which is the point. So people think when we're young that we are invincible, and unfortunately we're not. And the other statistic to bear in mind is the chances of any one of us developing cancer now is 1 in 2. So you've got a 50-50 chance pretty much of developing some form of cancer, which a critical illness insurance policy will be able to pay out, or pay out a certain amount depending on the terms and conditions. Now, of course, the thing to bear in mind that critical illness insurance, it doesn't matter if you go back to work and you recover. And don't forget that the fact that these days the ability of medicine and the NHS to be able to help us return to work and when we make a full recovery has improved, because obviously medical sciences have improved since back in the days critical illness was first designed in the 1990s. Now, the next myth is that the policy only pays out if you're basically terminally ill. So you are going to die, and it's kind of an early doors solution. Now, as I've just already alluded to, that's not the case. In fact, critical illness policies, some of them will pay out on stage 0 cancers. Now, they may not pay out the full amount that you insure. It may be a percentage, say 25% of it. But they do pay out, some these days. The policies are being designed to reflect our ability to survive some of these serious illnesses, which we didn't maybe back in the 1980s when critical illness insurance first really came to the fore. These policies are being designed to reflect that. So there are policies out there now that are purely severity based. Now, Vitality are a company that have gone into this realm where they actually will pay out based on the severity of the illness. So that means that they pay out on a greater number of illnesses, and they're more likely to pay out than they perhaps were previously, but it won't necessarily be for the full sum assured. Now, the other thing that people think on critical illness insurance is that insurance companies just pick and choose when they pay out, and that it's difficult to get a payout. Now, because it's a financial product, because they are regulated, these insurance companies have to treat customers fairly. It's what they call TCF. They don't have a choice in this. This is part of the regulation that's set out by the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, the regulator. And they therefore have to treat customers fairly, and all policies have T's and C's, terms and conditions. So when you take out a critical illness insurance policy, the T's and C's will be very specific about when and when they won't pay out. Now, of course, like everything, it's not universal, it's not standard. It's one of the issues with insurance products generally. It doesn't have to be things like life insurance or critical illness. It's even on home insurance and car insurance. They're all very different, which is why it's important to speak to somebody who understands the market, who can find the best product for you. So if we go on to the fourth myth. Now, the next one is that you don't need critical illness if you have life insurance, because they think, well, do you know what? It'll pay out anyway when I die. Now, that, again, is something that isn't true. And I'd like to sort of, if people take one thing away from this, that just because you have life insurance, that's almost like the bare minimum, which is the good level to be. Let's be honest, not everybody has critical illness insurance or can afford it. So you might start with the life insurance aspect. But if you go back to the idea of that 30-year-old I talked about earlier in the podcast that had a 14% chance of getting a critical illness before the age 65, then that same 30-year-old only has a 4% chance of dying before the age of 65. So doing the numbers very loosely, that means that your critical illness insurance policy is 3 times more likely to pay out before the age of 65. So the chances of you getting a critical illness is greater than you dying, but they're very different products that pay out on different things. Life insurance, you've got to die. Critical illness insurance, you've just got to be diagnosed with a serious condition. So it could be that you get a serious illness that means you can't go back to work or you are unable to work. The life insurance wouldn't pay out. So they're different products, and often they're sold together. And the life insurance can sometimes be just almost like an add-on for very minimal cost to a critical illness insurance policy. So if you're thinking about life insurance, it makes sense to look at critical illness insurance and get a quote. And the other thing to point out, which leads on to really the next myth, is that critical illness is expensive. Now, it is more expensive than life insurance. There's no two ways about it. But you don't necessarily have to have the same level of cover as you do for life insurance. You can tailor it and have a lower amount. That's what I've done. It's much lower than what I would get on life insurance. It's just because it tailors it to my own budget and also to reflect my own pre-existing medical conditions. And these are almost, I'm doing two myths here, which would have been sort of 5 and 6. Firstly, it's expensive. Well, it is more expensive than life insurance, but the younger you are, the cheaper it is. So again, let's think of that 30-year-old, just to give it some context. If they were going to take out a policy that would last with a term of, say, 35 years or whatever, take them to the 65 for £100,000 lump sum that would be paid out. That's £28 a month. If you were 40 and took out the same length of policy, the critical illness cover would cost you £45 a month. So if you do the maths, that's about £200 a year, and over the term of the policy be an extra £5,000 because you're that bit older. And it's because obviously the older you are, the more likely you are to develop things like cancer and any other serious illnesses. Now, of course, you have to offset the fact that you were a bit younger, your policy might go for a bit longer, but still, you're going to be thousands of pounds better off doing it younger than you are if you just leave it. Because everybody tends to push this back, oh, do you know what, I'll do it when I'm older. It's one of those things they'll do when they have more money. So you can tailor things to your budget. You can have a smaller amount while you're younger, and as time goes on, you can review all of this stuff. The fact that you have health problems, like anybody listens to this podcast knows I talk about Crohn's often. I'm quite open about my Crohn's disease. Then, of course, it will push up your premiums, but there are medical underwriting that goes on. So when you go and have a policy and want to get a quote, if you speak to an insurance specialist, what they'll do is they'll go to different insurers and work out the one that's best for you, because different insurers don't view all illnesses in the same way. They measure risk on a number of factors, including your age, but also your medical history. So it's all about finding and picking the right insurance provider for you. Now, the last myth is that this is all about debt. So you only ever get a critical illness policy to cover your mortgage, but you can use the payout for anything you like. So it can be for debt. So it could be for some unsecured debt that you have. It doesn't have to be a mortgage. It could be for anything else. But just as one quick idea that we used it before for people who are quite affluent, one of the issues they had were when I used to work back in the city, we used to have some very rich clients. And the biggest thing they were worried about was funding their pensions for when they retired. And so they had a plan that they were going to keep funding their pensions. So they get to the point, they'd put X amount a year away. And by the time they got to retirement, boom, they would retire at a certain age. Let's say they always wanted to retire fairly young, 55, and they could go off into the sunset. The problem was, if they got some form of illness, let's say they had a heart attack of some kind or particular cancer, then they wouldn't be able to necessarily work. And they were worried about the ability to be able to fund a pension. So we used critical illness cover in a slightly different way, whereby we worked out what the amount they wanted to put away into a pension almost over that period of time, and used it as a decreasing sum assured. So each year the amount that they were going to get paid out fell. And what we were really doing was ensuring the ability to fund a pension. So if they died at any point, what would happen is they'd get a lump sum which they can then use, wouldn't put it in their pension, but it would have a lump sum of money that would actually be able to be used to fund their lifestyle at that sort of going forward. So yeah, it's a slightly different way of thinking about it. It isn't all about paying out money to clear debt. Sometimes it's about being able to have a lump sum to do something that you plan to do anyway.
Yeah, there's another option actually with critical illness that I often advised on when I used to advise on critical illness and life insurance. There are people out there that think, well, you know, the lump sum is great, but what do I do with it if I'm not in debt? Exactly like you just said there. There is a situation whereby you might be diagnosed with something that is a critical illness by definition, but it might not alter your lifestyle much, but it might be like a debilitating thing that eventually you may pass away from. Now, it may well be that there is technology advances in different countries. So say like you get something that's been diagnosed, you can still maybe carry on a fairly normal lifestyle. Maybe you can even still work. So you don't necessarily need that lump sum, but you have got this illness that is there. You could potentially use that money to actually go and seek treatment abroad. So let's say that there wasn't the technology in this country that could actually treat you and you could fully recover from, but maybe you've still got 3, 4, 5 years of your life still to go. You could actually seek treatment abroad, fully recover from it. Maybe it costs 50,000 or 100,000 to have that treatment done privately, and then you could return to this country, carry on working, and it's just another idea. You don't necessarily always have to pay off debt. You don't have to put it in your bank, into investments. You could actually use that money to physically get the treatment you need. You can also use that money to make changes to your home if you needed to. Say you're wheelchair bound and you needed to put ramps and access to upstairs and things like that. So there's loads of things you can do with the money.
Yeah, and just to finish this piece off, to bring it nicely together with life insurance, okay, you die, it pays out. It's for something it's for your family, what's going to be left behind, and it's going to be able to solve any problems there. With income protection, it's obviously replacing your income, but if you think about what Andy just said, and it replaced your income, so your standard of living was similar to what you've got now, the problem is that you wouldn't be able to necessarily make all those changes to your home or something like that, because you haven't got a lump sum, you've just replaced your income level. So critical illness is something very different that provides a lump sum on specified illnesses, or when you're diagnosed. So there's slightly different policies that have different ways when they pay out, but used in combination, they're quite powerful. Now, nobody's really going to have the full suite, if I'm being honest. Very few people do. But there's nothing to stop you having a bit of each. It's sort of almost like something that people focus on life insurance but ignore the other two. So somebody who can advise you, a good life insurance specialist, like I said, if you go on Money to the Masses, you can find one. They will give you the combination that fits with what you need. So it's not a one size fits all. It's a solution that suits you best. Before we move on, Andy, I just wanted to quickly mention 80/20 Investor. Now, 80/20 Investor is my DIY investment service. Do go and check it out. I empower and teach people how to invest their own money. The service provides data-driven fund tables. The data is driven by my own unique 80/20 Investor algorithm, which I created. You also get stop-loss alerts, you get research articles and insights, you get market commentaries, monthly commentaries and DIY investment lessons, but you also get access to my £50,000 portfolio, which is a portfolio of my own money, which I run live on the site for members to see, and it shows people how I use the service to maximise my returns. And in the first 2 years of doing so, I turned £50,000 into £59,500, which is a 19% return, beating investment managers, professional fund managers, financial advisors, investment banks, passive trackers and the market. So everybody can have a free 30-day trial of 80/20 Investor, and you can claim that by going to moneytothemasses.com and going and clicking on the 80/20 Investor hyperlink at the top of the page. So go and try the service. Let me know what you think of it, and I know from the feedback that you're going to love it. But for now, on with the show.
So yeah, touching on something we talked about again last week, it was child benefit, and David's been in touch.
Yeah, David is he's been listening since the early part of this year, which is great to hear. We've always getting new listeners, and he enjoys the podcast. But he asked a very good question, which is based upon last week's piece on child benefit. So we had people who were not claiming child benefit because maybe one of the couple was earning over £50,000. Go back and listen to last week's podcast to save me going over all the rules and quirks again. But if you fall into that realm where you have decided not to claim child benefit, you can choose to claim it but opt out of receiving it, which is what you should do. If you've decided not to claim it and you're not working, then you're missing out on national insurance contributions, which could mean that you may not get a full state pension when you reach retirement state pension age. So David's question was, well, okay, I've fallen into that gap, my wife and I, this is what's happened, and what can we do to fix the gap in her national insurance record? Because obviously he wants her to have a full state pension. Now, the first thing to do is go and check your national insurance record. You can do that online. So go to the following website, which is gov.uk/check-national-insurance-record. So quite a simple URL this time. If you go there, you can actually get them to check your national insurance records. You can see if there are any gaps. So you therefore know the problem. If you're falling into that gap that David's partner has, then what you need to do is register for child benefit. So you can register for it but not claim it. Then you can backdate that claim 3 months. So you can't go back and plug any gap that you've had for a number of years. So that's the first thing. So you've gone and claimed back, you've backdated it. So the last 3 months you've got the national insurance contributions for that. Great. So we've moved forward. Problem is you've still got this gap on your record. Now you can fill that gap, and it's you're able to go back up to 6 years and plug that, and you do that by paying Class 3 national insurance contributions. Now they're voluntary contributions which you pay to plug any gap in your record. Now the amount you pay depends on the tax year you're plugging and what the rate was, but in the current tax year it works out at about £14.65 for a week. So if you go to that URL that I said, it's got more information on there about how you can plug any gaps you have on your record. So it is a problem, but it's one that can be resolved, but it can only be resolved fully by paying money. So it's not a case you can tick a box and clear it. You've got to, unfortunately, pay some money for those Class 3 national insurance contributions if you're going to estimate you're not going to have a full record by the time you get to age 65.
All right, so it's a special anniversary, Damien. It's been 10 years, but not really something we should be celebrating. But it's been 10 years since the Lehman's collapse, and obviously we know the fallout from that. So what have we got? What are you going to tell us?
Well, what happened, the anniversary was a couple of weeks ago, and 10 years ago Lehman Brothers collapsed. And for those of you who don't know what happened, the financial crisis was already kind of unfolding. It had been starting to, in 2007, the whole mortgage, the backed securities, everything was starting to go a little bit wrong. People realised that these dodgy mortgages had been lended out and packaged up, and it was basically all starting to unravel. And then Lehman's collapsed, and it was really the big trigger in the sort of investment and banking world, to sort of like dominoes. Everything started to unravel from there, and it wasn't the financial crisis itself; it had already started, but it was one of the big catalysts for the next period and the escalation of the financial crisis, and in particular the recession that then came and that hit the whole world. Now, what I wanted to talk about is 10 years on, so why do we still talk about it, and is it even relevant? And unfortunately it is relevant, and it's actually very relevant to people's investment portfolios, because what happened after Lehman's collapsed is that the financial system, all you've got to worry about is, don't really worry what Lehman's were doing or anything like that. All you need to focus on is that one of the big dominoes fell in the banking world and the financial world. And that domino sent a lot of other dominoes tumbling. And what it showed is how connected everything was. And we were apparently pretty much moments away from the whole banking crisis, or the banking world just almost imploding. And that's pretty scary to think about. But in order to stop that, what happened is the central banks around the world just went and found that panic button and hit it really hard, and just unleashed what is now called quantitative easing, QE, or money printing, which we've talked about in the past.
Watering the garden. Watering
the garden, as I talk about, flooding the garden to try and make something grow. And in doing so caused all sorts of puddles, and that they didn't intend to. So they cut interest rates and they flooded money into the world. What that did is it meant there was more money going around to hopefully be washed around, and like I say, the water analogy helped to make the economy grow. And by cutting interest rates, and hopefully that money was meant to find its way into through the banking system into everybody's pockets of companies, and us as consumers would go out spending and the economy would pick up. It kind of did do that to obviously a certain degree. It was quite slow at first, and now the global economy is picking up. But it's like a patient that's in a coma that's on life support. And so the doctors that put the patient into a coma in the first place are now administering all the drugs to try and get it out. And we're trying to get to the point where we can take the drug away. And that is very simply what this whole withdrawing of QE, of unwinding central bank balance sheets, so that's the amount of money that they've basically printed, and the raising of interest rates. It's trying to remove that drug to get the patient, the world economy, the UK economy, the US economy, to be able to wake up and stand on its own 2 feet. Remove it too quickly and you'll send it right back into a coma, which means a recession. Now, what happened and why this is relevant to investment today is because immediately after Lehman's collapsed, in the sort of next 6 months, the stock market fell about 40%. So that is like, wow, huge. And I remember it at the time, and everybody was looking at each other thinking, well, what do we do? I remember the stock market going up and down 5% in a day became commonplace. I mean, that'd be unheard of at the moment. That'd be like, people would be quite frightened. But it was a daily occurrence when you're back in that point. If you look at a chart of the stock market since the collapse of Lehman's 10 years ago, there's this little tiny blip on the left, which is that 40% fall. And then there's just drawing a straight line from bottom left to top right that goes flying upwards. And it is about 125% growth. You're like more than doubling your money. And so it makes that initial fall, you can barely register it. And that is the point of QE and what happened. Central banks pumped so much money in, they watered the gardens so much that they caused these puddles, and all the money just started to flow into riskier and riskier assets. And it is actually almost by design what QE does, as we've talked about before, because people are encouraged to take more risk. If you don't get any money or return on your savings account because interest rates are low, you'll take your money out of the bank and buy riskier investments. That means bonds, eventually stocks and equities and shares. That just starts going up. And of course, therefore, what it meant is that rich people got richer. So if you had assets, your quid's in. If you didn't own anything, you basically lost out, because what happened is the economy, it's improved, it's ticked along, but wage growth, there wasn't any real wage growth. So inflation also picked up. So you're probably worse off in the last few years than you were previously, because your wages aren't growing, but inflation's growing. And these are all almost byproducts of the aftermath of QE. Now, the reason why this is interesting from an investment perspective is because all the headlines we see now about what's going on with the trade war, what's going on with Apple, all these share price and everything like that. Because obviously, as I talk about every now and then, Apple's share price has a disproportionate influence on the stock market. So all these things feed into the mix. But behind all of that, the trade war is no doubt one of the biggest stories that's influencing markets, certainly in the short term. But the long term, if you just take a big step back and look at that picture I described earlier about the chart of the last 10 years, fundamentally, all that's happened, if you'd bought anything, you would have made money, because central banks had your back. They were pumping so much money in, and they still have basically, they tinkered with markets. It's an artificial market. You're making money. The lesson of the last 10 years was don't fight the Fed. The US Federal Reserve, which flooded pretty much the most money out there into the markets, central banks followed suit. Whatever the central banks are doing, betting against them was the worst thing you could have done. There were people who are licking their wounds who have done so or have sat on the sidelines. And so in this period going forward now, you've got to keep an eye on what the central banks are doing, almost more so than the trade war, because the trade war is starting to take a slight sideline. The market is ignoring it. They're now realising the central banks, what they're doing is actually fundamentally still driving the markets behind the scenes. And that as the central banks start to raise rates, people worry, will that mean the stock market will crash? But history shows that the Federal Reserve in America raise rates until they break something and then they stop. So it's important to keep an eye on what the central banks are doing. So keep an eye on interest rates, because fundamentally this is probably going to have the biggest impact on your portfolio over the long term than what is going on with Apple share price and all those sorts of things. Because if the market tanks, it's what the central banks do. And the last 10 years has shown that they are what is really driving markets. So what you could say is that there was a big bang 10 years ago, but the echo is still reverberating now and influencing markets. And what you've got to think about is that when are we going to get the next big bang? When is the market going to implode? And it's quite a nice parallel you can draw with what goes on in physics. People talk about the big bang that happened billions and billions and billions of years ago. And when that bang happened, all the mass in the universe flew outwards. And they sit there and say it's accelerating. Now there's a theory that gravity is starting to slow the pace of expansion. And actually, they think what might happen is the gravity starts to slowly pull things all back together again, and eventually, in billions and billions and billions of years, everything will start racing back towards the middle again, and all collapse into one big mass, and then there'll be another big bang, and it will just sort of keep going like that forever. What is interesting with the financial world is it works kind of in the same way, and it's likely to, because we're already heading towards the next big bang. The next financial crisis is already on its way because of what's happened in the previous one, because of all this artificial money, because of the way that they responded to it. We're creating distortions, this big expansion that we're already probably accelerating back towards the next big bang. And the next big bang will probably be a financial crisis that won't be necessarily the same as the last one, but history shows that each of these crises that you have in markets is almost a result of the previous one. And so what it could mean is that when you're looking for what will be the next big bang in economics and also in the stock market, it's probably going to be a sign of the previous one, and we've got to look for some sort of narrowing, some sort of things are starting to contract back towards something, and that could be balance sheets stop expanding, so that means central banks start unwinding QE, so like the universe, it's no longer expanding, neither are their QE plans, they're starting to raise rates. That is likely to show the next one that's going to be happening. And the other thing is, the bull market in stocks is narrowing. It's starting to go from being everything going up to now, if you look, emerging markets aren't going up so much, and that is partly because of the trade war. The bet on Europe stocks have struggled compared to America. And in fact, in the last, if you really were to take a bet on describe what happened in 2018, and if you'd taken a bet at the start, just buy American stocks, you'd have been quids in and pretty much ignore everything else. And that narrowing has gone even further, which is just tech stocks. And this narrowing tends to be what happens in the late stages of bull markets. So it's almost, again, taking this whole expansion and then contraction and narrowing. It could be that that's where we're heading towards. So, taking this in the round, what can we learn from the last 10 years? Central banks are probably going to dictate when the next financial crisis happens. And when it does, it could be that their response will be what drives the market back up again, because they've got our back. And they've got this tendency to keep doing it. And almost the last crisis shows that perhaps we shouldn't fear the next crash, because it could be the next big opportunity to make money. And I'm not saying that that's going to happen. So keep an eye on the 10-year US Treasury yield, because that's a good indicator of what central banks are doing, because obviously as that rises, it shows a form of tightening. But don't obsess about headlines. Focus maybe on the big picture.
Good stuff. And if you want to get in touch with Damien and have your question answered on this podcast, or just to give any feedback, please do so. It's Damien at moneytothemasses.com. That's the email address. Or you can also send your questions and feedback over on Twitter. As I say, Damien is hot on Twitter right now, so get involved there. It's at moneytothemasses with the number 2. We're done, aren't we, Damien?
We are done. And on that note, Andy, if anybody does want to send over any feedback, particularly things how they feel that Money to the Masses has helped them, I love to hear that, because going forward we're actually revamping and redesigning a lot of stuff, so it may come in really useful. But that's it, Andy. That's it for this week, and so until next week.
Till next week.
Don't forget to claim your free copy of Damien's best-selling book, The 30-Day Money Plan. Sort your finances in just 5 minutes a day, worth $4.99. Just go to moneytothemasses.com/podcast to find out how.